Daniel, let me introduce you. So Daniel Montero is a journalist and producer with the independent news organization Belly of the Beast. He graduated from the University of Havana School of Journalism and will be speaking to us today about the US-backed SOS Cuba campaign. So go ahead, Daniel.
Yeah, thank you very much. Okay, so I'm gonna try to summarize what's been going on in Cuba. It's a lot, so I'll try not to make it too heavy. So back on July 11th, the biggest anti-government protest in decades happened here in the country. Now, the reason why this is relevant to people in the United States to be up to speed with this is because the United States plays an important role in the different elements that led to that protest, and the United States government's response to what happened in Cuba is essential for the situation of the country right now. So going in phases. Now, Cuba has a very dire economic situation, right? The United States has applied sanctions for over 60 years. It's basically an economic war that the United States calls the embargo, we call bloqueo, the blockade. Now, what this means is that the United States puts into effect policies that make it hard for Cuba to do business, not just with the United States, but with pretty much every country in the world. I won't get into that so much. I'm assuming some of you might have a background on what this is and means. Now, going to the Trump administration, these sanctions became a lot worse, right? More than ever. And during the Biden administration, thus far, those policies applied by Donald Trump have not changed. Now, the reason I'm mentioning this is because in Cuba, we were very happy that anyone other than Trump became president, right? Because situation here got real bad during Trump. And we were hoping that would change, but it didn't. And the reason this is relevant is because that is one of the main reasons why protests happened on July 11th in Cuba. We've been in crisis for a long time, but never in the way we have been in the last year and a half, between combining the sanctions of the United States and also, of course, the situation of COVID. Now, there was a lot going on social media with the hashtag SOS Cuba. Now, there's a number of investigations that have come to the conclusion that some of the, let's say, some of the accounts put in this campaign into the spectrum were fake. This doesn't mean that the situation in Cuba was not worthy of hashtags and of people supporting it. However, it's interesting that during the protest and after the protest, the attention that this has gotten from international media, specifically in the United States, for instance, is huge. Now, if you compare the attention the protests in Cuba have gotten to perhaps the ones that happened in Colombia this year, you would realize that the response, not just from the media, but from the politicians, has been quite different. For instance, in July 11th in Cuba, I was there. I can tell you that thousands took to the streets. It lasted one day, July 11th. Hundreds of people were detained, and one person was confirmed to have died as a result of the protest. Now, in Colombia, thousands were detained, dozens died. Now, it might sound a little cold to put these things into numbers, but the reason why I'm doing it is because the response of the United States to these two protests has been very different. And if you listen to media, mainstream media, you might get the impression that the protests in Cuba lasted many weeks, right? The reason why you might have perceived it this way is because after the protests happened in Cuba, all the attention turned to Florida, specifically Miami, where a large population of Cuban Americans resides. Now, the reason why these people are important when it comes to this subject is because right now, all the United States policies towards Cuba is determined by a small group of Cuban American hardliners that support a policy of applying more and more sanctions against Cuba. A lot of us were hoping that the Biden administration would take on the path that was set by Barack Obama of re-engagement, but that has not been the case. That has not been the case so far. Actually, the response of the Biden administration to what happened on July 11th has been completely misguided, and I'll tell you why. They have focused on three main elements as a response to it. One, they're saying they're going to bring internet to Cuba. Two, they're saying they're going to bring vaccines to Cuba. And number three is that they're going to put in place an infrastructure for sending remittances to the country that doesn't go through the Cuban government. Now, the reason this strategy is wrong is that those three things we already have. Cuba has internet. I'm actually talking to you, obviously, through internet, so we already have internet. That's one part. Vaccines. Well, Cuba actually has more than half of its population has already been fully vaccinated. And before the end of the year, all of us are going to be vaccinated. Cuba has actually produced 5 vaccines of its own, 2 of which have already gotten results of having more of 90% efficacy. And number 3, which is remittances, they are still getting inside the country, the remittances sent by relatives in the United States through other media, other ways that are not the Cuban government. So this is what they have focused on, 3 things that we already have. Now, if you ask me what they should focus on, and this is the whole reason why I like talking to Americans, specifically Americans that are involved in politics, that are interested in what happens around the world, is that the whole focus should be to eliminate sanctions. I can tell you that every issue that Cuba has, every problem that we have, is in some way related to the United States sanctions on Cuba. Now, we could argue into how much each of those issues is related to that, but I can assure you that every one of them has the United States as one of the leading responsible. Okay. Now, do we have problems of our own? Of course. Could our government do better? Of course. But none of that eliminates the fact that the United States plays a leading role in all of this. And so far, it is not acknowledging that role, which is something we would have expected from the Biden administration, as I mentioned earlier. I'm not sure how much time I have left. I'd like someone to help me with that. Or should I keep going, or should we ask some questions?
Jesse D, 7 minutes left.
Yes. So I'm gonna use that time to tell you, to expand a little bit more on the period that has led us to July 11th and to 2021. Okay. Now, I mentioned before that the Trump administration had imposed sanctions in a harder way than administrations before. But I want to give you a better idea of what that means in practice. Okay. First of all, any sanction that is imposed on the country affects the Cuban people. The reason I'm saying this is because if you hear the narrative of the United States government, it will tell you that sanctions, the embargo, is applied on the Cuban government, and it doesn't affect the Cuban people. Now, this is a lie. Why? So governments provide services. In the case of Cuba, particularly, those services are quite large. We're talking about health, we're talking about education. So if you affect that government's capability of doing business, of having money, of trading, you are affecting the people. Now, that's number one. But there's also other sanctions that were imposed that affect people directly, such as remittances were cut. That affects the Cuban people. A lot of us have families in the United States that often send us money. Others, tourism plays an essential role in our economy, and cruise ships and flights were banned. Our tourism had grown more and more with the American tourists. and that slowed down in a way that affected us, particularly those that had grown in the tourism sector, the private touristic sector. Back in 2018, the whole country basically got paralyzed because the United States got oil from coming into the country. That's one. And those are just a few. During the Trump administration, more than 200 new sanctions were applied against the Cuban people. This is basically a war, and it goes unnoticed. Now, all of this, more than 200 sanctions, are still in place right now. The Biden administration has done nothing to eliminate any of them. Okay, actually, it seems like they might apply even more. At least that's what we're seeing, we're feeling, right? And this is important because after July 11th, a lot of people have come out and say, we support the Cuban people in their fight for freedom, for democracy. And to listen to an American politician talk about supporting the Cuban people without mentioning the fact that the United States policies are the leading cause of our issues, and not referring to the fact that they have in their power the solution to those issues. Well, that's basically lying and being a hypocrite. And that's obviously not new to us. We are used to the hypocrisy of US politicians. But in this particular moment in time, it feels worse. Why? Because I do think there's a lot going on in the country right now. It's a very politicized situation right now after July 11th. And I would like that the solution to our problems could be achieved by a dialogue between Cubans without having to consider foreign powers. But that is never the case. For Cuba, for Latin America, whenever you are trying to reach a better place, you have to consider the United States and the positions they're assuming. And that is the whole reason why I like talking to an American audience, because Americans get to vote for people that get to decide my future and the future of my country. And that's sad, that's depressing, but that's just the way it works. And that's why I'm always happy to talk to people, because our problems depend in a large way to whoever sets policies in the United States.
Gracias, Daniel. So we can go ahead and take questions in the chat. Just go ahead and put stack in the chat, and I'll start. I've done a lot of solidarity work with Venezuela, and one of the things I know, Elena Duhan, which is like a special rapporteur for UN, talked about how, or she wrote a report about how sanctions disproportionately affect women, that women and children particularly bear the burden of illegal sanctions, US sanctions in a variety of countries. So I was wondering actually if you could just briefly touch on that topic.
Yes, of course. Okay, so Cuba, like every country in the world, has problems with patriarchy, with machismo, right? We have a long way to go to fix them, to address them correctly. Now, if you realize that that's the basis for responding to your question. So whether we like it or not, women still play the leading role in providing for the family, basically. I don't know, putting food on the table and number of domestic tasks. That is a reality for the majority of Cuban families nowadays. Now, if you consider that to be a fact, then you realize that whichever sanctions are applied that affect the country's economy and that affect the Cuban people affects women and children more, because they're the ones who have to deal with the larger part of the responsibilities within the household. I think that's the basic thing. We could get to specifics, and I think the same could be said for the African descendants in Cuba, if we consider that we still have those issues, we still have those problems being in reality in Cuba right now, then whichever sanction is coming from the outside comes to add to the already existing situations in the country. So I think that is the way I would explain it without going into specifics.
Okay, thank you. Next on stack is Mitch.
Thank you for your presentation. My question is, are the Cuban American hardliners that you refer to replacing pressure on pro-sanctions, I guess, are they part of a lineage that goes back to the revolution in the part of early 60s, or this is like a new formation? Thanks.
That's an excellent question. Thank you. So for a long time, I mean, the Cuban American lobby that pushed for sanctions actually began in the 1980s, and those, of course, are the ones that come from the conflict that was the Cuban Revolution and the large migration. But if you look at the pro-sanction crowd right now in Florida, it is mixed in terms of the generation they belong to, and there's a number of reasons why this is it is so. Now, of course, the political and economic conflict that goes on in Cuba that makes people migrate, it's still going on. For a long time, people migrate for economic reasons in Cuba to Florida. And I think you have to understand that in the state of Florida, the Republican Party is much more powerful than Democrats, especially when it comes to the Cuban Americans. If you think that they are the Cuban Americans are the only Latino minority that votes mostly Republican, then that tells you that there's a groundwork going on there. And the other thing I think it's fair to say is this: Trumpism has also changed the picture. Right now everything is so politicized. If you say you're supporting Cuba, at this point, you're basically supporting communism, right? And I think the Democratic Party is so scared of being given that tag right now that a lot of people tend to run away from that. Now, there's something interesting I'd like to mention. The Florida International University conducts a poll every year on Cuban Americans in Florida, and they ask them a number of questions in reference to the United States policy towards Cuba. And back when President Obama changed the picture and re-engaged in relations with Cuba, for the first time, the poll showed that a majority of the Cuban Americans in Florida polled actually supported engagement. They were opposing the embargo. Now, the fact that happened in the only moment in time when there's been a different approach by the United States government, that tells me that leadership matters. So whichever path is chosen by those who are supposed to choose those paths defines those that are Cuban Americans, or defines whoever people is involved in this policy. I hope I've answered your question.
So we only have a little bit of time for Q&A. Does anybody object to letting Evan and Cameron briefly ask their questions? Okay, all right, thanks. Evan, go ahead if you could be brief, if you don't mind.
Sure, yeah. My question is just about the imperialist messages that are sent to us through American politicians, and wondering if you wanted to take the opportunity, you already spoke on this to a degree, but if you want to take the opportunity to dispel any more of the myths around Cuba, Cuban people, around the nature of your government and democracy, because that's not the message that we're fed over here.
Thank you. Yeah, of course. I think if you consume mainstream media, every message you're going to receive coming from Cuba is bad. And I think that is the main problem, because we do have issues, but the truth is, like any other people, we have good and bad. I think if I had to speak on the good, and if I had to speak on the good for an American audience, I think the main good I could refer to is health and education. We have both are universal and work very well. That's basically it. However, in terms of July 11th specifically, I think there's been a number of lies coming to the mainstream media. And it's basically the fact that the things being said by politicians are not refuted in any way. Like, a lot of people refer to the Cuban government as being a failed, Cuba being a failed state, failed government. I think, well, does the Cuban government have issues? Of course, but the country has managed to survive a major crisis caused by the United States and by COVID, and come out mostly unharmed. So I think that speaks not to a failed government, to a government with contradictions, with problems, to a country that needs to get to a better place, sure, but not to a failed state. And I think there's a lot of accomplishments that go directly to the path that has been chosen by Cuba. There's a lot of good things to be said about it that sadly don't make it to mainstream media because of how politicized the subject is.
Thanks. Next, Cameron.
Hi. I was thinking about the motivations of the people who implemented and currently support an embargo like this. And I can only come to really two conclusions for like their goal. And that is either a goal of domination on just, Cuba, trying to implement a different economic system for whatever benefits they think that could bring, or essentially genocide by starving people out. And I can't realize another conclusion for their morality other than essentially straight up evil. And I was curious what your thoughts were on that and whether other Cuban people that you know of have a similar perspective.
I wish I had a different view than the one you're given. I wish I could justify what's done with some form of greater good from the United States, but I can't. I think that even back in 1960, the Undersecretary of State Lester Mallory referred to the policy that the United States should apply in Cuba by saying we should bring about hunger and despair to the Cuban people so they cause a regime change. That has always been the basis for the United States policy towards Cuba. The whole goal is to make things bad enough in Cuba until we change, that we take out this government and become capitalist, basically. Now, there is a lot of profit to be made from a capitalist Cuba, of course. A lot of people would love to really come in and invest. If you look at Cuba before the 1959 revolution, you could, there's a big history of the Italian American mafia in Cuba, of the relations between, so there's a lot going on there that it is a part of that. But I would say that today, the main reason why politicians refuse to change that cruel policy is simply votes. It is the myth that it is impossible to win Florida unless you are hard on Cuba is still in place. And Biden, even though he didn't win votes with the Cuban Americans, he's chosen to go down that same path. And the other thing is there are also congressional seats the Democratic Party lost in Florida that they don't think they can win back unless they're tough on Cuba.
Thank you, Daniel. We are out of time for this section, so any last parting messages?
I would just like to thank you for the opportunity to speak to you all, and I would like to thank you for being interested in this. I think the main way for me and for all of us to actually make a change in what's going on between the relations between US and Cuba is information, it's communication. So thank you for that.